The deadliest foreign attack on U.S. soil shook the world 20 years ago. Its impact still reverberates today. Four hijacked airplanes killed nearly 3,000 people on September 11, 2001. But the response to those attacks would kill hundreds of thousands more as the U.S. launched its controversial War on Terror. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Now, for anyone watching at the time, the raw shock of the images broadcast 2 decades ago can never be forgotten. The immediate response to the horror of the September 11th attacks was one of unity. It brought Americans and the world together in solidarity against terrorism. But it wasn't long before the response to the attacks divided allies and alienated many, especially Muslims. The images were like nothing we'd ever seen. New York's iconic skyline covered in smoke and ash after hijacked commercial airliners crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. All 110 floors of both buildings fell to the ground. Another hijacked plane would hit the Pentagon in Virginia, and a fourth would crash in a Pennsylvania field. Then U.S. President George W. Bush announced America is under attack. And his administration soon revealed to the horror of Muslims around the world that the attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda, a group claiming to act in the name of Islam. Days later, the U.S. administration formulated its response, declaring a war on terror to take down Osama bin Laden and his network.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Well, in spite of the provocative rhetoric, most of the world was with the United States, as its NATO allies and others backed the invasion of Afghanistan in full solidarity. But months later, talk of another invasion would pull those allies apart. The Bush administration insisted, with questionable evidence, that Iraq's Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction and possibly harboring al-Qaeda terrorists. And they argued those unproven threats merited launching a second war. The U.S. got the backing of UK leader Tony Blair, but not of its staunchest European allies.
You have to make the case. And to make a case in the democracy, you must convince by yourself. Excuse me, I'm not convinced. This is my problem. And I cannot go to the public and say, oh, well, let's go to war because there are reasons and so on, and I don't believe in that.
Well, in spite of international efforts by the United Nations and others to prevent another war, in March 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. And that's when the solidarity fell apart, not only at the geopolitical level, but many say Islamophobia in the United States reached unprecedented highs. Some started describing the response to 9/11 not as a war on terror, but a war on Islam. So did the U.S. get its response to 9/11 wrong, and what have been the consequences of that foreign policy ever since? To discuss that, I am joined by law professor Khaled Beydoun in Detroit. He's the author of American Islamophobia and a leading scholar on the war on terror, national security, and civil liberties. From Boston is professor of Islamic history and a former CIA operative, Glyn Williams. He's the author of numerous books on Afghanistan and U.S. military campaigns in the Muslim world. And from Colorado Springs, we have John Spencer. He's the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute. Thanks all so much for being with us. John, I'm going to start with you and get your opinion on the actual response to 9/11. Do you think anyone can say that the war on terror has been a success? Because even if there hasn't been another attack on U.S. soil, the return of the Taliban, the destabilization of Iraq, the continued existence of al-Qaeda, and the rise of Daesh would certainly at least indicate a bad strategy.
So personally, I agree with everything you just said, but I still view that the values of what the American leadership throughout the years, and especially right after 9/11, were in good manner, and it did make 9/11 changed the world, And the American response, I think, did help the world in the removal of the Taliban. For sure, only 20 years, but it did help the world in the reduction of terrorists with international objectives and the betterment of the Afghan people. Yet, if you're going to judge the results of today, but the war on terror did make the world safer, in my opinion.
Okay, Khaled, so the values of the 9/11 response, according to John, there were in good faith. Arguably, he says that it helped the world. Do you agree there?
No, I disagree fundamentally and wholly. I think that the world was left in a far worse place, in a far more dangerous place as a consequence of the war on terror. I think it's critical to understand first the racial and sort of religiously bigoted dimensions of the war on terror. Terrorism was being framed exclusively as a Muslim phenomenon and an Islamic threat. So I think that framing of terrorism in and of itself is an indictment on the war on terror being a bigoted war. Second, I think recent events in Afghanistan, are a stark indictment of the war on terror. The fact that we launched the first transnational war was on Afghanistan to unseat the Taliban. The Taliban came back in a matter of weeks. I think that it's also, to be candid with you, it's also vital for us to bring to clarity what the true objectives of the war on terror were. The objectives of the neoconservative Bush administration that launched the war on terror was never to defeat, terrorism at large as a amorphous phenomenon, or to defeat Al Qaeda, or to defeat the Taliban. These were all means. These were all means to essentially expand U.S. imperialism in the region, and also as a means to, enable the U.S. to claim access to oil, claim access to opium fields in Afghanistan, and to expand its geopolitical reach.
John, I first saw you nodding your head, but then I saw you shaking your head in disagreement with the alternative agenda that Khaled was possibly suggesting there. I'll let you reply, John, quickly, and then I want to get to Brian. Go ahead.
So sure, and it's great to have the debate. If you don't think the world is safer today, I think 9/11, the biggest terrorist attack known to man at the time, changed the world in our ability to reduce international terrorism. I don't agree that the American agenda, and I think it was actually counter to what was exactly just said. And the belief of the terrorists at the time, fundamentalists, was that Western powers wanted access to Muslim land and Muslim resources. And I think the last 20 years has shown that's not true, and that once the Americans established presence, their objective was always democratic leadership.
Khaled, I saw you raise your eyebrows there, but please, I do want to bring Brian into the discussion. I've been seeing him shake his head the entire time. I mean, I imagine, Brian, you do not think that this war on terror has ever made the world a safer place from the beginning.
Well, let me come down decisively against this proposition that we invaded Afghanistan for the oil. As Khalid said, there is no oil in Afghanistan. And as for us invading Afghanistan, as for us getting Afghanistan to get the opium, that's preposterous. We killed opium warlords, and there's very, very little natural gas or resources in Afghanistan. We never exploited it. We never brought in Exxon and built pipelines to ship oil down from Afghanistan.
What about Iraq, though?
Well, Iraq is a whole different proposition. I would submit to you this. I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. The war that overthrew the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2001 was led by Muslims. General Dostum, an Uzbek Muslim who I lived with for many summers in northern Afghanistan, was a Muslim. So when Khalid says it was framed as against Islam, don't forget it was thousands of Muslims who overthrew the Taliban with the aid of just 300 U.S. Special Forces. We did a lot of good in Afghanistan. We brought down the infant mortality by half. We raised GNP. We doubled it. We doubled life expectancy. We demined the country, and we did make the homeland safe. When was the last time, I ask all three of you, when was the last time we had a mass casualty, a 9/11 style or London style or Paris style attack on the homeland, or in France or London? We have made the world safer by destroying this organization called Al Qaeda. We eviscerated it with the drone strikes in Pakistan. We arrested thousands and killed thousands of Al Qaeda, and that group disappeared for a generation. My students at UMass Dartmouth have never known a mass casualty Al Qaeda attack.
Okay, I want to come back to Khaled then. Because as for the invasion of Afghanistan, Khaled, I mean, I remember thinking at the time that even if it's complicated, you know, and Al-Qaeda and bin Laden prove elusive, as they did, at least a regime that robbed women of all their rights, that, you know, banned music, that carried out public beheadings,
Yep.
and that suppressed all opposition, would at least be taken out. And that could be the minimal silver lining of the Afghanistan invasion. But today, I mean, the Taliban is back in power. So what did the response to 9/11 actually mean for Afghans?
Well, look, I mean, I think many of the policies and many of the positions of the Taliban are abhorrent. I definitely oppose their stance on, you know, the rigid fundamentalist perception of Islam is one to be, you know, condemned and critiqued. But for us to believe that that was the principal objective of U.S. intervention of unseating the Taliban, I think that was a supplemental incentive. I think that the United States, and look, this was an attack on American soil. 9/11 was an attack on New York City, and an attack on Washington D.C. The natural response should be, I think, twofold: to tighten up our borders here stateside and making sure that American citizens are safe from future attack. It shouldn't be a license for a transnational war on an element. The Taliban never attacked the United States. The Taliban were isolated exclusively in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So how do you justify transnational war after a domestic attack? Then second, I think, just to sort of expand this conversation, Al-Qaeda, the organization which conspired and led the attack, is Saudi-based. And again, I think that it's a misnomer, and I think it's vital for us to discuss the United States' relationship with the Saudi government, right, and the ideology of Wahhabism, which drives Al-Qaeda. So I would say that the war in Afghanistan was a misdirected war. It was misaligned with the actual events that unfolded in the United States. And as a result of that, as a result of the Taliban emerging quite rapidly, it's a full-fledged, specifically the war in Afghanistan is a full-fledged failure.
Okay, Brian, let me put this to you. I mean, as for Afghanistan then, you now have a Taliban that's awash with upgraded weaponry. It's already defeated the Panjshir resistance that survived the Soviets and the Taliban in the 90s. You have men who have bonded with Al-Qaeda, now in positions of power. So if the purpose was actually to eliminate threats to the United States in Afghanistan, what was really achieved?
First, let me go back to Khalid's point. He said Al-Qaeda is Saudi-based. That's flat out wrong. Al-Qaeda was based in the Taliban Emirates of Afghanistan. We asked Mullah Omar to surrender the terrorists after 9/11.
I didn't say that.
They did not. You said they're Saudi-based. You said they're Saudi-based. Let me finish. You said they're Saudi-based. Let me finish. You said they're Saudi-based. Let me. You said they're Saudi-based. Let me finish. Let me finish. You can't cut me off. You can talk when I'm done. You can talk when I'm done. You can
Hold
talk
on.
when I'm done.
Yeah.
I
Let me
won't
let
go
Brian
on.
finish quickly, Khaled, and I'll come right
Thank you.
back to you. Go ahead.
Thank you. You said they're Saudi-based. They're based in Afghanistan. We had to destroy that sanctuary. When we hit on Pearl Harbor, you had to go after the empire that attacked us. We had to go after Afghanistan. We did it. We destroyed Al-Qaeda for 20 years, no attacks. Now to the question, I think ultimately we had 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. They were the finger on the dike. We could have kept this country, democracy, women's rights, Muslim minority rights like the Hazara Shiites. We could have kept that country secure for decades to come on a small footprint with almost no American lives lost. Trump sold out the Afghan people by making this deal with the Taliban. Biden sold them out by enacting it. And I spent a lot of time with the Afghan people. I've come to love the people in that country. The ones who,
Okay, Brian,
saw,
I just want to stop you there and pick up on what you said, that those 2,500 soldiers that were still in Afghanistan actually kept the finger on the dike, so to speak. Then, I mean, was the mission in Afghanistan, where did it go wrong? The Taliban was overthrown so quickly and so efficiently, I might add. But many would argue that the mission in Afghanistan was thrown under the bus for the Iraq invasion.
I agree completely. You know, I think we had a noble mission in Afghanistan, which started out as counterterrorism, then it devolved to counterinsurgency, then ultimately nation building. And we invested $2 trillion in nation building, the largest overseas building project in world history. But it did devolve when the Bush administration sold a pack of lies about weapons of mass destruction and links between Saddam Hussein, who was a secularist, drank whiskey and was linked to the Russians, and linked him to Osama bin Laden who was a Saudi fundamentalist who wanted jihad. The Bush administration conflated the two, duped the American people into invading the wrong country. That sucked all of the oxygen, all of the resources out of the original war against Al Qaeda, which was based in Afghanistan, not Saudi Arabia, and it sucked all of that oxygen to the wrong country. And we actually destroyed a firewall against Sunni jihad and Shiite jihad that is Saddam Hussein's socialist secular government in the name of fighting, ironically, Al Qaeda.
Okay. I mean, Khaled, I can see you very much disagree. But do you at least draw a line between the mission in Afghanistan and the mission in Iraq, or do you really feel they were both completely unjustifiable invasions?
Well, first of all, Brian, who's using like really arcane Orientalist language that you think would be outdated 20 years after the war on terror, is really, you're really
like
interesting. And then he's
ISIS.
Oh yeah, jihad, fundamentalist Sunni jihad. Yeah, these are arcane Bernard Lewis.
Okay, let's let Khaled finish, Brian.
Yeah, great. So like he's done a great job confusing and conflating all of my points, and you know, not surprising that. So he's saying that the war on terror has made the world a safer place for whom? The hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilians who were killed, the million innocent Iraqis who were killed. How about the 10 million Muslim Americans here stateside? Let's talk about domestic surveillance, and let's talk about the war on terror stateside. I'm Muslim. I live in a Muslim American community. I can tell you about how the war on terror has affected my community. So who has the war on terror? Say it again.
I'd agree with you in the Muslim community. Homeland Security, the arrest of innocent American Muslims was disgraceful. I agree.
Oh, but it wasn't disgraceful for the innocent civilians who were killed abroad, right? It wasn't disgraceful for the innocent civilian Iraqis.
Especially in Iraq, it was very disgraceful. I agree completely. 100%, I agree.
Well, now you agree, but you said that the war in Afghanistan was a successful war, and it's critical. And this is
the war in Iraq from Afghanistan.
The war on terror was the broader war on terror was a linked and closely united campaign. If there was no war in Afghanistan, there was no war in Iraq. It essentially was the prerequisite that enabled the war in Iraq. So you have to view that. You have to view. Please stop cutting me off. You have to please. I didn't conflate and confuse your statements like you did mine. So you have no right to cut me off.
You cut me off though.
Just go. Yeah, Khaled, go ahead. Brian, just let him finish, please, and I'd like to move on. Go ahead.
You know, so when people say things like, you know, really guy statements like it's made the world a safer place. For whom? Again, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in Afghanistan. Upward of a million people, innocent civilians, were killed in Iraq. 10 million Muslim Americans here were policed. Their civil liberties were entirely shelved and eroded. So maybe a safer place for white Americans. I can concede that. To people like Brian, indeed a safer place for people like him, but not for people like me, not for Afghan Americans who have family in Afghanistan, not for Iraqi Americans who have family in Iraq, right? So I think that when we talk about safe for whom, this is a very racial conversation, and you know, again, it's critical for us to sort of bring to light that it's the war on terror, both wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, you know, made it an intensely violent and dangerous place for people who share my faith and people who look like me.
Wow, there's some really.
My wife who's Muslim. My wife who's Muslim benefited from having no attacks on American soil in America, and I think all Americans benefited from having no mass casualty attacks, including Muslims. Muslims died in 9/11
I think most Americans of color will tell you that the January 6th insurrection on the White House was a violent terror attack, and that's a problem. Is that the war on terror is framed as a specifically Muslim threat, and again, it's been negligent because it's given a green light for essentially white supremacist groups to rise. So let's talk about terrorism in that regard as well.
John Spencer, you know what? I'm going to come back to you. I mean, I can see you. It's hard. It's really hard because there's so many issues overlapping, and you hear agreements and disagreements on different levels because the war on terror isn't just one broad thing. It was many facets and still is today. But I have to ask you, John, specifically because you served. And I want to ask you specifically about the consequences for the United States, I guess reputationally, as a beacon for democracy that it always wanted to be and always said it stood for, beacon for democracy and human rights, especially when it came to the images that came out of the war on terror and played throughout the world, be it Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay over the last 20 years. What position did it leave the United States in as far as the democracy that it wanted to represent throughout the planet?
Yeah, I mean, you have to judge the results, right? So if you judge the context of why we went to Afghanistan and why we went to Iraq, you have to, one, judge it from that moment in time. Now we're judging the results. Is Iraq a better place because of US involvement? Yes, huge mistakes were made. And yes, the images of Abu Ghraib created more terrorists than we could ever do in our time based on the mistakes of a few bad people. But the greater populations of both Afghanistan and Iraq, are they in a better place today than they were, or in the last 20 years before the war on terror? And the
Okay.
war on terror was about improving our ability to stop terrorists that have international, not just the US. Yes, we protected the homeland. We, just like in my mind, the Munich attacks of 1972, the entire world was improved by our ability to gain intelligence and to awareness of these ruthless people that want to hurt everyone in the world, to include the United States.
Okay. Khaled, let me ask you this. Seeing that the Taliban is back now in Afghanistan, what will the United States actually do? What would be justified for it to do if Al Qaeda does actually return? Um, could another invasion to keep the United States safe actually be justified now? Or has all the goodwill and understanding been squandered?
I think the writing's been on the wall for years. If you closely track what's been taking place in Afghanistan for the last several years, you knew that what's taking place right now was inevitable. The United States essentially curated the landscape for the Taliban to claim power, and that's exactly what they did weeks ago. We're seeing the reemergence of ISIS. When we talk about Al Qaeda, right, it's critical to understand that that isn't the only transnational terror network that was menacing the world. ISIS was in fact far more menacing and far more threatening regionally, and specifically to innocent Muslim populations in the region. So in the United States government is by no means static and monolithic. You would think that the Biden administration, which just pulled out, would not re-intervene in the coming years, but what might happen in 2 to 3 years here, is up in the air. We might see a more hawkish right-wing government come to power. You're seeing Trumpism being far more appealing, and you're seeing whenever Islamophobia and xenophobia stateside here spike, that essentially drums it beats the war drums, if you will, for a re-intervention in Afghanistan, and I think that's very possible.
Okay, Brian.
Especially with the Taliban being in power.
You don't agree, Brian, that another intervention could be possible if Al Qaeda and Daesh combined raise its head again? What is the U.S. supposed to do to protect its interests?
I think we've been burnt. We spent $2 trillion in Iraq, $2 trillion in Afghanistan. The greatest threat, I think Khaled will agree with me now, is the January 6th style white Proud Boys, pro-Trump, anarchist, QAnon people who are trying to overthrow the government. The FBI is no longer focusing so much on Muslim terrorism, Al Qaeda terrorism. That was destroyed by the drone war in Pakistan. Al Qaeda isn't the threat it was back then. The Taliban will never allow that group to use their land as a springboard for another 9/11 style attack because they paid the price. They want the $50 million we have here in our banks in America, $50 billion. So the Taliban are not the same Taliban as 2001. I don't think there'll ever be an intervention in Afghanistan again. The American people wouldn't support it. We have drained so much treasure, so many thousands of lives building a failed nation state there. It really is the graveyard of empires, and there's no appetite by the Republicans or Democrats. And of course, you mentioned those pictures of Abu Ghraib. They embarrassed me as an American. They were a recruitment tool for ISIS. There was no ISIS in Iraq until the Bush administration invaded a secular socialist country that had nothing to do with Al Qaeda, overthrew that government.
Okay. We're running out of time, and I do want to get, John, let me get some final words from you, especially regarding any other potential invasion should terrorist elements in Afghanistan raise their head again and threaten the U.S., as they did in September 11th.
No, so I do not believe the U.S. would invade Afghanistan ever again. I also do not believe the U.S. will allow Afghanistan to become a safe haven for international terrorist organizations. So just like when we left Iraq, if a nation requests assistance in their own fight against international terrorism, then we would provide that aid. But the United States of today is not the United States of 20 years ago either. Our ability to strike terrorist organizations is a lot different than it was pre 9/11. And I don't think we'll allow Afghanistan to ever become a safe haven, which is the reason we invaded.
Okay, John Spencer, I will have to give you the last word. We are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you all so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.